Conversation is part one of the webinar series, How to Put the Just in Just Transition. My name is Willow Prince. I am the education coordinator here at Indigenous Climate Action, and I will be moderating the conversation today. We are joined by communities of color operating in allyship for ASL interpretation. Our interpreters today are Hercules and Jenny, and you'll see them spotlighted throughout the webinar series here today. And I will pass this over to Elena Starrett of Gizgas Graphic Recording to speak a bit about the work and how she's showing up in the space today.
Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, whatever time it is for anyone. My name is Elena Starrett, and I am a graphic reporter from Gizgas Recording, which is my company I started about 3 years ago now. So what I'll be doing today is live capturing the conversation, drawing on my iPad. There's somewhere I'm sharing my screen and you should be able to see what I'm doing. And I'm really excited here to be listening and be a witness to your guys' conversations. And I'm very excited to be a part of this webinar series with you guys. I will be here for the next two after today's. So thank you everyone for allowing me to be here, for being open and honest, and we'll see you guys in the next ones. Amia.
Thanks so much, Elena. Really looking forward to having you for the next 2 Thursdays as well. Today we are joined by Melina Lubacan Massimo, Farron Rickerby Nishi, Daniel Taselli, and Thomas Joseph Tewinalden. I will pass this off to Melina to introduce herself.
Hello, Tansegwakia, Nia Melina Miowapan Labokan Massimo, Nia Nihiao, Kina Skumtanawao. My name is Melina Miowapan Labokan Massimo. I was born in my community of Little Buffalo, which is Lubacan Cree First Nation. It is in Treaty 8 territory. And I'm really happy to be here because I'm from a community that has been impacted by oil, gas, tar sands, and fracking and logging since I was born and was on a blockade at the age of 7. So just transition really means a lot to me, and it's a very personal reason. And I'm really excited to be here as one of the lead authors of the Just Transition Guide that we just launched this past year, and really happy that ICA and Sacred Earth have come together to have these webinar series to bring more people into this discussion. So hi, thank you, Willow.
Thank you for that, Melina. I'll hand this off to Farron.
Hello, everyone. It's so nice to be here. My name is Farron Rickerby Nishi, and my pronouns are she, they. I'm calling in from the traditional territories of the Comox First Nation today, colonially known as Merville on Vancouver Island. I am a curriculum developer at Sacred Earth Solar, and I've been really fortunate to work with both ICA and Sacred Earth on a number of projects starting in about 2020. We did a Indigenous Youth Needs Assessment and then worked further onto the Just Transition Guide, where I was able to participate in some of the policy work. And then now I'm back at SES working on curriculum so that we hopefully can get out some education and training programs to the communities that we're working with. I am a Japanese Canadian settler, and I think in large part my call to this justice work is because of the experiences that my family members had in the Japanese internment, and I'm just really inspired by their resiliency and their history. And I hope to bring the care that they brought to their communities to this work as well. So it's really lovely to be here with all of you, and I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Wonderful to have you, Farron. I will pass this on to Daniel.
Hi, everybody. I'm Daniel Taselli. I'm Dene. My nation is Kashagotene. We're one of the Arctic Dene nations. My home community of Radeliko is known on the map as Fort Good Hope. It's about 25 miles south of the Arctic Circle. So we're highly impacted by climate change. And that's what's brought me into this work around climate justice and also the rights of Indigenous people. I've been in this sphere for a while, and I'm currently on the board of ICA, and I'm happy to be here, and I'm honored to support that work that's being led by ICA and Sacred Earth Solar. Masi, thank you.
Awesome. Thanks for that, Daniel. I'm super excited for today's conversation because we have a few faces that are new to myself, like Farron and Melina, and some folks that I've had the pleasure to share some space with, like Daniel and Thomas. And speaking of Thomas, I will pass this on to Thomas.
Thank you, Willow. My name's Thomas Joseph. I am joining this conversation from my ancestral lands of the Hoopa people, unceded territories in what's now known as Northern California. I'm the carbon pricing educator with the Indigenous Environmental Network, and with that, I follow climate policy internationally, which has led me into a just transition following the United Nations COP and the United Arab Emirates. They created a just transition pathway to start pulling back from fossil fuels. Moving into Bonn this last summer, we've seen that that is not the case that a lot of the global North countries want to now be involved in. And so I've been following that work diligently, and it's an honor to be here with everybody. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks for that, Thomas. Yeah, today's awesome because we have some panelists that have worked on a lot of materials, some of the first materials that we've seen around Indigenous-led Just Transitions, like the Just Transition Guide that arose from Melina's master's thesis at the University of Victoria. We have one of the contributors to the Just Transition Guide, Farron. Thomas Joseph's organization, IEN, has the Indigenous Principles of a Just Transition. And Daniel Tiselli has decades of legal experience in the North working with communities and highlighting the Indigenous leadership up in the North. And I'm very excited for today. So for this first question, we can start off with Melina, if that's all right. So since you put out the materials, you started the materials for the Just Transition Guide, and it really grew to be something quite magnificent with these other organizations as well, like ICA and the David Suzuki Foundation. When we're talking about just transitions, Melina, how would you define a just transition? And how might this Indigenous-led just transition differ from some of our mainstream or colonial understandings of a just transition?
Well, the just transition term came back in like the 90s with like labor unions, environmental justice advocates, and it was very, and also low income communities of color, but it was very focused on workers because of the need to transition workers. And a lot of those workers are from our community. So of course, it's not about leaving out workers. We want to have workers transition, but the focus was on the Blue-Green Alliance was that it was the workers focused. And for me, as I was coming to really look at just transition in about 2012, 2011, we had a massive oil spill in our community and my family was being poisoned. And at that time, I was already campaigning against the tar sands and really wanting to see change, but I felt like, what does that look like in terms of us implementing a just transition? We can talk a lot about what just transition looks like, but what does just transition look like on the ground? And that was a part of why I went back to do my master's and implement a project called Pitapan, which was the coming of a dawn, a new era of actual project implementation in the heart of the tar sands in my home community, which our community built as one of the first solar projects, almost a decade ago, that wasn't, people hadn't seen solar panels at that point. And so if you're going to leave communities behind, then just transition doesn't really exist for me. So I was thinking, well, my community is being poisoned by toxic fumes wafting into our communities. The community school has to be shut down. And we're talking about just transition, but I'm not seeing it implemented on the ground. And so for me, I really wanted to see the implementation happen on the ground. And so that was where the idea of the Just Transition Guide came out of, was wanting to ensure that our communities were the ones that were implementing the solutions to the problems that we know so well. And so for me, that's what Just Transition is that it's Indigenous-led, it's Indigenous visioning, it's Indigenous dreaming, it's Indigenous, that we're the energy champions on the ground implementing those solutions that make the most sense for our communities. And so that's for me what Indigenous Just Transition looks like and feels like. Hi.
Thank you so much for that. That was awesome. Yeah, like that last note that Melina was talking about with Indigenous people leading the way on the ground. According to Indigenous Clean Energy, there are over 2,000 projects across so-called Canada that are either mentored or led by Indigenous peoples and communities. And it's really great to have you here, Melina, today. And also to contextualize a little bit about how ICA came to be, with Melina as a co-founder as well. A lot of the activities and programming from ICA arose in direct response to organizing and resisting the tar sands that are across Alberta. And a big part of Just Transitions that we speak about is how do we move away from these energetic economies that have left such harmful legacies of harm over the last few decades, and how do we avoid replicating those same errors? Oh, thank you, Melina. For this next question, I will move over to Daniel. Daniel, how would you define a just transition? And keeping in mind that the North is very unique with consideration to resources, accessibility, and policy as well.
Yeah, so a just transition is acknowledging, as you alluded to, the huge amount of power that is wielded on this planet by fossil fuel corporations, and how the infrastructure and just the systems that we need to live, and also how entire economies are premised on fossil fuel extraction. So we know we need to stop burning fossil fuels if we're actually going to stop climate change. But making that shift has all of these potential impacts for not just things like people's jobs and the economies of entire communities and regions, but people's ability to survive on a day-to-day basis when you think about things like home heating fuel in the Arctic. So how do we shift away from fossil fuels in a way that doesn't just not hurt people, but helps build a better world? And as Melina was saying, this is a concept that came a lot out of labor and non-Indigenous organizing. And I think from my perspective, one thing I'm looking at right now is how does, now that this is a shift that is being looked at more broadly, not just in Canada, but in the rest of the world, how do we do this in a way that does not negatively impact particularly remote northern and Arctic, predominantly Indigenous communities? Because right now, when I look at not just my community, but a lot of other communities, the reality is that we're far removed from a lot of regional and large centers, large municipalities. A lot of our communities are fly-in only, or only have winter roads. And a lot of communities like my community have an isolated electrical grid that is built off of 2 large diesel generators that's run by a power corporation, with existing government of the Northwest Territory policies that these municipalities cannot put more than 25% of that grid coming from renewable energy because it impacts that diesel infrastructure. So we look at things like the costs of infrastructure and shipping to these communities. We look at the existing infrastructure and those government policies, and we see that realistically, we can't transition entirely away from fossil fuels in the same time frame that southern centers have the ability to do that, right? So what I'm looking at right now in that particular context is that there needs to be an acknowledgement that the issue of climate change, the crisis we're currently in, has been largely caused by non-Indigenous populations in the global north, but more in the southern portions of those nation states. And the burden of the short-term urgent transition away from fossil fuels has to be borne by those populations and those communities. It's the people who have profited from burning fossil fuels for the last 300 years who bear the burden of making this rapid shift and leading that charge, because they're primarily responsible for the current climate crisis. And they also have the most resources to make this type of transition in the short term. And what I'm looking at now is, for example, with enormously high food prices at the grocery stores in Arctic communities, and that connection, the cultural, linguistic, spiritual, and political connection we have with the land, that if our people are going to continue going out to hunt, not just to create food security and sovereignty, but to maintain that connection that we have with the land, it's not feasible that we'll be able to transition those practices away from things like a gas-powered outboard motor in the next decade. And so I think we need to be pushing the just transition in the communities that we can, and we need to make acknowledgments so that not every Indigenous community is going to be able to shift away from things like gas as quickly as non-Indigenous large population centers. But the last thing I'll say on that is that I think the vision of us shifting away from fossil fuels entirely in our communities is an exercise of sovereignty, because right now the goal of colonialism for decades and centuries has been to take our people off of the land, put us into communities, and make us dependent on the wage economy. And this has created a situation where now that we depend on money to survive instead of just being on the land, we have to support the industries that are destroying our land and destroying our planet. That's predominantly fossil fuel and mineral extraction industries. And so there's a self-perpetuating cycle where we depend on that, and then it's our people who are supporting and pushing that. So it's like they say, don't bite the hand that feeds you. And if you feed yourself, you don't have to worry about that. So we should always have that goal of being entirely self-sufficient in all of our communities, moving away from dependency on the wage economy, dependence on the state and state power, and dependence on these large corporations. But I think we also need to acknowledge that it's going to take a little bit more time in a lot of our remote Arctic and northern communities. And we need to make accommodations for that, because in order to continue our connection with the land and maintain our culture and language through this transition, we need to be out on the land.
Oh, thank you for that, Daniel. That was incredible. So many amazing points and so many things to consider when we are talking about climate change and the response, especially the further north that we get. Yeah, there's so many great points in that. I think one of my favorite ones was talking about how it's not necessarily our fault or our community's fault that we ended up in these industries or in these relationships to the land because of how predatory capitalism is. And like what Daniel was talking about with, the prices of fuel and food up in the north, and how like they're not willing to change the infrastructure and the reliance on diesel and fossil fuels when there is literally the option to switch to renewable or clean energies. And so it's insane. And it's just acknowledging that a lot of our people and communities as Indigenous people are living lives that are the symptoms of colonization and not living from the synthesis of our own culture. And so for this next part, maybe we could hear from Farron about how you define a just transition.
Yeah, I so appreciate all the words of the folks that just spoke before me, and I really echo their thoughts. I think to me, a just transition really provides a framework and a set of strategies for us to move away from these extractive economies that are very carbon intensive and exploit the land, the water, our communities, and move us towards low carbon, regenerative, self-sustaining, and more sustainable ways of life. And really that shifts the balance of power from colonial governments and corporations back into the hands of communities, and really centers the voices and the leadership of the people that have been disproportionately impacted by these colonial policies, by climate change, by capitalism, and these systems of oppression. And I think a few of the things that I was really grateful to learn from the communities that we were working with as we were writing the Just Transition Guide was just how, from an Indigenous lens, the just transition is so interconnected. So it moves past renewable energy. It's land, water, culture, it's food systems, it's our housing, it's health, well-being, our collective community care. And on the note of care too, is just the sense of love and care and hope that really comes from an Indigenous just transition. I think we get caught up in a lot of the chaos of the climate crisis and these oppressive systems. And so to see the love that people have for the land and their communities just fills me with so much hope. And I think it's really important to have that with us as we're going along on this journey. And then, as some other folks mentioned too, I think it's very responsive also to, like, directly responsive to community needs, and it isn't stagnant. So even as we're continuing on this just transition journey, we're still constantly reflecting on how we can improve and make sure that it's a more equitable future for everyone. So for example, with like lithium mining and critical minerals, just making sure that we are acting in a good way moving forward as well. And then I think too, like, one contribution that I'd like to make just as a settler, and if there's any other settlers on this call too, is that like this is a really meaningful way for us to be in solidarity with Indigenous communities and really uphold the responsibilities that we have as settlers to unlearn these like very internalized oppressive systems and learn the truths of our history and move towards reconciliation and true decolonization, and create these mutually beneficial relationships, and really follow the leadership of Indigenous communities and their guidance. So, yeah.
Thank you so much for that, Farron. I feel like you put the biggest smile on my face when you were talking about love. And like, that is just not something that's really ever centered in conversations around the climate. But it's something that needs to be acknowledged at a very deep level, because what we do is a labor of love, you know? And this action, like taking climate leadership, Indigenous climate leadership, this is a labor of love to the land. This is a love letter to future generations, you know? And so I'm really glad that you talked about about love and how important it is to center that understanding when we engage in this work. I was also hearing some notes in what Daniel and Farron said about power and some of these systems of oppression or harm and how they wield power against us, you know, and Farron was talking a bit about how there's people, specifically like Black and Native communities, that are disproportionately affected by policy, by environmental racism, and all of these things. And so when we start talking about a just transition, specifically Indigenous-led just transition, Serena Mendizabal kind of explained it in a really great way as this just transitions being the area where Indigenous climate action meets renewable energy, you know, and so we avoid replicating those harms from previous energy eras, while, you know, building people up, like kind of what Daniel was saying, that we need to ensure that people are not just getting hurt, but that we're actually building better worlds. And so thank you for that, Baron. That was really awesome, and it spurred off a lot of thoughts. And last but absolutely not least, I would love to hear from Thomas Joseph about how do you define an Indigenous-led just transition?
Thank you. And thank you for the panelists before me. That is awfully hard to follow up. Sorry if I come across as mansplaining some of those really important pieces that were uplifted through everybody's talk. You know, since colonial contact, we have been fighting for our right to continue to defend our territories, our waters, our lands, our airs, and the sacredness and the integrity of our Mother Earth. And this fight is equally important since contact as it is today, as we're witnessing climate policy being weaponized against Indigenous people, how the global North is weaponizing climate policy towards the global South. And so it's very vital that we continue to uplift the importance of the integrity of Mother Earth and the importance of the sacredness of all of our elements and our biodiversities. We see how the biodiversity conference in Colombia that's coming up is focusing on also trying to access unceded territories of Indigenous peoples. And this just transition, it has been also used or taken by the other side, and it's not really uplifting the real principles of what we see as a just transition. And so the Indigenous Environmental Network has moved forward with creating what we would say what an Indigenous just transition looks like. And there's three pillars that I'd like to briefly go over. The responsibility and relationship that we have. We must transform our relationship with our Mother Earth and nature from property-based approaches to recognizing the legal bearing rights that she does have. And as Indigenous just transition rejects the continued commodification of our Mother Earth. You know, when we look at climate change, we know that climate change is caused by the burning of fossil fuel. But some pillars of that as well is colonialism, is patriarchy, is capitalism, and this continued desire to continue to develop and to continue to exploit our Mother Earth. We need to change that approach. In just transition, we can't see our Mother Earth as an ability to cycle and store carbon as a property to be bought or traded or sold on a global market. That we need to understand that the transformation will demand us to take greater responsibility for how we interact with our ecosystems and recognize the importance of our first commitments that we've made, our first treaties will it be to our Mother Earth and the protecting her sacredness, and that this relationship that we have with her is a reciprocal relationship, that she needs us just as much as that we need her, and that this relationship that we've built over thousands of years has allowed her to flourish. You know, we see here in the stateside how they have set national parks aside and they've called it wilderness and they've taken people out. And then now we see the raging wildfires in California because that reciprocal relationship has been broken. Indigenous Just Transition also recognizes the sovereignty of our lands, waters, and territories as a core of our existence. We are the land, we are the water, the water is us. We have a distinct spiritual and material relationship with our lands and territories, our water, our ecosystems, and all life that are linked to our survival. This includes our treaty lands and unceded lands and waters. And that's a very core piece that I would like to also lift up is when we see a just transition, we recognize the importance of the sovereignty of those indigenous peoples, and that the 80% of the world's biodiversity is in the tenure of indigenous peoples because they're led by their core values. They remember their indigenous responsibilities. And so land back is a just transition. We don't want to co-manage territories. These colonial states have proven to us that they do not have the ability or the understanding or the care or the love to manage these lands. So we don't want to co-manage with them. We want land back. And this won't just benefit indigenous peoples. This will benefit the entire globe, our entire Mother Earth, all of the biodiversities, all of the non-indigenous peoples will also benefit from the indigenous leadership of these lands. You know, and it's also very important for formation and action. We need indigenous-based green economies, native energy, justice, and democracy, clean energy and energy sufficiency, community-based healthcare and health centers, sustainable community-based planning, ecosystem restoration. We also what my friend Carol from ICA said this morning, you know, you are the just transition. Being here and being active and doing your role is part of that just transition, and creating space for people that hold that knowledge, uplifting the importance of indigenous leadership in that indigenous-based structures. You know, our indigenous knowledge is greater than any university system on the globe. It outdates all of that. That is the science that needs to come forth. We are the first scientists of these lands. I'll check there. Thank you.
As always, Thomas, I feel like that was an incredible amount of bars. And I feel like had the pleasure of being a part of a webinar with Thomas Joseph last fall. And I think a lot of things that Thomas Joseph said, even just now, like will definitely stick with me. But from that webinar last fall, Thomas Joseph talked about how cooking the books is cooking the planet. And I really like that Thomas touched on how climate policy is weaponized specifically against the global south. And what we see at these climate change conferences is absolutely mind-blowing, because we see these climate change conferences with the highest attendance rates being oil and gas lobbyists. You know, for instance, like the COP29 that's carrying out later in November, the president is a former oil and gas CEO. And so what business do these oil and gas executives have in climate change conferences or climate change discussions? And it all comes back down to the power and the energetic stronghold that colonialism unfortunately has right now on Turtle Island. And I really great thing that Thomas just said too is land back is a just transition, you know, and it's a genuine climate response. And speaking of land back, Thomas, I'll actually bring you back up because I saw a bit of a celebrity sighting on some reporting around the historical dam removal on the Klamath River. If you want to speak a bit about that and how, again, just land back is just transition.
Thank you. That has been an amazing experience. We were actually invited to watch the very end of that dam be breached and for that river to run freely. And this is something that me and my family and our community has been working on for 20 plus years, and it wasn't an easy battle. Of course, corporations pitted our communities against each other, but it was the frontline community-based approach that held that line, that made sure that we were continued to fight for those dams to come down. And we would have salmon runs every year from the mouth of the salmon up to those dams, where the youth of our community would run over 300 miles to take those prayers up and to show the world and to show corporation that these dams will come down. Many naysayers, many people say that won't happen. And I feel that in this work that we're involved in collectively, there's a lot of naysayers, but we got to remember that, when we push forward and do what is just for our Mother Earth, it also allows our communities to heal and to come together. And that it takes a lot of effort, a lot of prayers, and it's the world's largest dam removal, and it's the water's really dirty and messy right now, but it's going to clean up. She knows how to clean herself. We need to stand in solidarity with our Mother Earth and allow her to clean herself, and we do the footwork. The heavy lifting was not those construction workers. It was the community peoples sticking to their values and making sure that those dams were probably one of the most beautiful experiences of my life, to see that river come to flow freely like that. So thank you for acknowledging that, Willow. Appreciate it.
Of course, literally anytime. That's really incredible to hear. And did you guys hear that? Like, the largest dam removal in human history. Like, that is such a massive win, and like really grateful that you're a part of this webinar and that you were just able to share about that. That's really awesome. I guess on this, we'll keep up this note about land back as a genuine climate response. And so maybe I'll ask some panelists about maybe some specific examples of land back in your communities or your areas, and maybe some of the changes that you've seen or heard about, or we could talk about some like community amplification, but we're definitely looking for some place-based answers here. So maybe we can invite back on Farron. If there is anything that comes to mind about land back as a climate response, or experiences where you've witnessed communities get their land back, et cetera, I'll hand it off to you.
Sounds great. Yeah, I think land back is such an important response and tool that we have right now. And a lot of settlers, I think, should come to understand that this can have many different meanings for many communities, whether that's like actual land rematriation, or if it's about self-determination and decision-making power that informs things like Indigenous stewardship or policy decisions. And I think it's important to include kind of all facets of what land back can and should mean across multiple scopes of our work and across all areas of the just transition. And like we said, it's not just energy, it's everything. And I think that so many approaches to stewardship and land back within Indigenous communities are already like inherently connected to the just transition, like being low carbon and regenerative and relationship based. And kind of on the note of land back and like stewardship, I think it's important to also recognize that communities have been structurally excluded from this work historically and ongoing. And so I think a very important part of land back is just making sure that these values and voices and leadership of Indigenous communities are really brought to the forefront, both of like colonial policy, but also like decolonizing the policy that we have. And like, perhaps that also means like moving away from colonial systems and forms of governance and really following the guidance and leadership of what Indigenous communities are suggesting for the path forward. I think in terms of kind of lived examples of community work, I love talking about Kanaka Bar, and I know Melina does too. So for the Just Transition Guide, we had the opportunity to chat with Chief Patrick from Kanaka Bar. And I think that the work that their community is doing just really fully embodies a just transition because they've got their small scale hydro project that's providing energy for the community. They have food sovereignty projects that are providing food and medicines for the community. They've done like climate impact assessments, so they're seeing where their community might be vulnerable moving forward. And with all of this, they're involving their community, whether that's through like youth programs or volunteer programs. So just really, really blown away by the incredible work at Kanaka Bar.
Thanks so much for that, Farron. Yeah, on that note of the Kanaka Bar, a project that accompanied the release of the Just Transition Guide was a mini video series called Power to the People, in which they highlighted communities that were leading this switch to renewable energies, leading Indigenous-led Just Transitions. And so Kanaka Bar is an episode of Power to the People, and I'd highly suggest checking that out. Yeah, no, that was awesome. And I think on that note about structural exclusion that Farron was talking about, is that, you know, in these climate spaces, in the access to resources or information about renewable energies, it is by design that racialized folks like Indigenous and Black people are historically excluded from these spaces and from these decision-making tables. And it was kind of what Daniel was touching on also in that question beforehand about how, you know, the structural integrity, they're not willing to compromise on that. You know, they're not willing to change. And so eventually we have to ask ourselves, do we want to continue to try to change these systems and these processes, or do we actually want to just break into an entire new cycle and build a world for ourselves that's sculpted in our own image? And I will pass this on to Melina, if you want to talk a bit about land back as a climate response, as a just transition, and some community experiences as well.
Sure. Yeah, my community was, you know, as somebody that was a 7-year-old on the blockade in 1988 and fighting and blocking oil and gas trucks that were coming into our community because there was starting to be miscarriages and for women in our community. And I was born around that time they started seeing those miscarriages. So naturally, my family was on the blockade, and all the families were on the blockade at that time. And that was a part of, you know, the continuation of land back until we finally got our rights recognized. And it was a long, decades-long fight, you know, 70 plus years until 2017 when we could finally call our community a reserve, because it was a hamlet for a very long time. Not that we actually want to fight to be a reserve, but we want to fight for our own territorial acknowledgement. And so now we have our identified territories where we have our culture camp, where we have places where our communities can now go and don't have to fight against oil and gas that's all around us. So land back, you know, looks different for each community. And I had the privilege of seeing it in other communities. So then I helped, you know, start to build the solar projects in my community. And then we're going for a larger 1.5 megawatt in the coming next years. And so that's one thing, but it looks different in every community because each community, even though we have the generational impacts of colonial and mission schools, both in, you know, across the medicine line, we also have our own differences of how we want to implement a just transition and how that, yeah, just transition is land back is just transition. These issues are all interconnected. And so what I was able to see across the country, actually, we went from coast to coast through Power to the People. As a host, I was at the time doing research at the David Suzuki Foundation and was able, you know, had the privilege of visiting the communities in Power to the People, and went to Kanaka Bar, went to Bella Coola, went to Haida Gwaii, went to Listugush, and seeing communities putting up a variety of different types of technologies, eco-housing, food security, in which they were pushing for, you know, tribal land stewardship and guardianship. And so, yeah, I definitely say for folks that haven't seen Power to the People, if you want to take direct inspiration from what communities are doing across the country, I'll just put the link in the chat. So Here's one for Kanaka Bar. And then you can actually watch the episodes either on TV that's playing on 3 different networks up here in so-called Canada, on the Knowledge Network, on the Weather Network, and also on the Aboriginal People's Television Network. It's also playing in Australia, but unfortunately not in the States. I'm so sorry. So for our US brothers and sisters, yeah, there's other places to watch it, or just use a VPN. But yeah. We went to one of the communities that I'm thinking about was where they put up 47 wind turbines in their territory, and they had to push back against the Quebec government for just even putting these up, where they were calling for a tender of communities where they were allowing energy developers to put 150 megawatts in Mi'kmaq territory, and where they were saying into communities, well, you can put up 24 megawatts. And communities were like, that's not actually economically viable for us. So they pushed back. They said, we're not applying for your tender. Your tender is BS. We're actually going to apply for what you're allowing for energy developers. So they joined together with an energy developer that they trusted, and they put up one of the largest Indigenous owned wind projects, probably in the world, but in the country here. And it's, yeah, I went to go visit it, and it's, I'll put that link up there, but it's just amazing. What another community where for them land back was to just like we saw in the Klamath, like where that community and Thomas Joseph's family has been fighting. There's been many communities as well fighting for fish farms to be removed from their community. So we went to go visit communities on the West Coast that were pushing for the removal of fish farms. And so we were privileged to go into a potlatch where they were doing their traditional their Indigenous governance, where they were saying, you know, these fish farms they're finally being removed, but that community had to fight for many, many years. So we saw Jew exchange, where they have, you know, these like looping systems that come into to warm and cool their housing, where it's just a surface of a looping system. It's called geo exchange technology, where we've seen that in multiple communities. So there's so many different implementations addressing the climate crisis, while also taking land back, you know, because one, you're putting those projects in, you're essentially exerting your jurisdiction on your homelands, because you need that land, that space for whatever projects that you're doing. So definitely put the links there so people can see. It's 22 minutes long, but it's jam-packed with information that people can see how that looks different in each community. So I'll end there.
Oh, thank you so much for that, Melina. That was awesome. Yeah, like that first note that Melina was talking about with, you know, seeing a 7-year-old on a blockade line. That's insane. And like a lot of people, I think, throw around terms like land defender or like water warrior, but that doesn't acknowledge that we are the land. You know, we're not like land defenders, we are the land defending itself. And so it's incredible to see the resistance span many generations. You know, we see folks like what Melina was saying, a 7-year-old on a blockade front line, you know, to elders and matriarchs and stuff like that. And so the resistance is intergenerational and it's inter-community. Yeah, no, that was awesome. And like kind of what Melina was saying as well, with communities to be like more place-based when we're talking about enacting just transitions in communities, because you know, while there are a lot of common threads of continuity to be found in Indigenous communities, but while avoiding this idea of pan-indigeneity or treating us all the same, you know, and so it's so important to be place-based in our considerations of how to enact a just transition, how to enact land back. You know, everything comes back to that relationship to the land that all of our panelists have touched on today. Thank you, Melina. So we heard from Thomas, Farron, and Melina, and so that leaves us with Daniel. If you want to tell us a bit about land back as a genuine climate response, or any specific community experiences that you've had with land back in the North.
Absolutely. I want to start with a very brief overview of some of the history of our interactions with state power and settler governments, and that the interest that settlers have always had in my people and our land has been economic. And so at the point of first contact in the late 1700s, they made money off of furs. And at that point, it was beneficial for them economically to keep us living on the land in a traditional lifestyle, because they made money off of that. And there's clear documentation from Canada, from their archives, that Canadian governments and those settler powers had no interest in extending treaty beyond the northern boundary of Treaty 8 at that point. My community is in Treaty 11. And this was largely in response to calls from like priests and other people who were saying there's famine, there's new diseases, there needs to be some type of support. Canada had no interest in governing that land and helping people when there was no white people living there and when there was no economic benefit from the extraction of minerals and hydrocarbons. It was the discovery of oil predominantly at the Norman Wells Proven area, which is about 100 miles upstream from my community, in the 1910s, that really was the impetus for Canada to enter into Treaty 11. And the purpose of that, from Canada's perspective, was to, as they say, extinguish Indian title and secure their legal position to exploit that oil resource. And that's well documented. And so Canada's interest in us and our land has always been about how do they make money off of that? How do they profit off of that? And it was that oil field that really shifted that approach from having us on the land getting fur to getting us into communities dependent on the wage economy. Because when you have Indigenous people who maintain that connection they have with their land and who are living a self-sufficient lifestyle, it presents a barrier to that capitalist exploitation of that type of resource, like oil. And so that was really when they entered into treaty. They started establishing a government presence, the state presidents in what's now Treaty 11 territory. And they started the aggressive colonialism of my people was because of that oil field. And so that Norman Wells Proven area, which is owned 2/3 by Imperial Oil and 1/3 by the government of Canada, is the reason that we have now these, like, any type of formal relationship with Canada. That was the entire reason for them trying to control this land, to try to make us Canadian and to try to establish governments on our land. So the fundamental approach to decision making by the state has been to support oil extraction. And that's obviously garbage from anybody's perspective. When you look at it like that, that is not a good way to deal with any land on this planet. We've seen over the decades since then that in all the formal dealings we've had with state power, the tendency has been for them to continually cement control over the land. So at this point, I work on formal dealings with colonial governments, with the government of Canada and the government of the Northwest Territories for my nation, in rights negotiations and other issues. And the mandate that the people gave us very clearly, and particularly the elders, was we need to get back control of our land and everything that happens on our land. And so for my nation, that's what land back means. Nobody cares like whose name is written down on a land titles paper in a land titles office in Yellowknife. Like, no one cares who owns the land. They don't even care if there is a land titles office. What they care about is who's making the decisions about what happens on our land. And that should be us. It should always be us for our entire land, for every decision. That's a position. And that is an ambitious position, but what we see is that as Thomas was talking about, the historic concession that Canada has been willing to make is this system of what they call co-management, which means that it is still the settler government, the colonial government, either Canada or the Northwest Territories, who actually has decision-making power over what happens on our land. And there's some process where we have participatory rights in that decision-making process. So we can go to like some board tribunal hearing, like a regulatory hearing. They'll consult with us. They'll hear us out, listen to what they say, but they make the decision, right? And so our position is, if that's a good system, if that's fair and that makes good decisions, then let's do that, but let's switch it around. Our nation should make the decision, and we will consult with Canada and Canadians. We'll hold the hearing, and the government of the Northwest Territories can make presentations at that, right? So in the formal dealings, we're trying to shift that narrative. We're trying to spin that narrative against them. But I think the biggest progress that we've seen recently is the potential for actually implementing requirements for free, prior, and informed consent into the decisions that are made by state power. In the work I do, I always try to manage expectations, and I tell people I like our position. It's principled. I agree with it personally, but it's going to take a long time to get control over everything that happens on our land, to have the state agree to that. But implementing free, prior, and informed consent is a positive step forward that acknowledges our right to have some decision-making power over what happens on our land. And I see that as something that we can actually get agreement from state power on in the near-term future. And so right now, that is where a lot of the formal dealings we're engaging with are heading towards, is recognition of free, prior, and informed consent. And one thing I'll also mention that I think is really powerful. I'm a huge supporter of nonviolent direct action, and working outside of state sanctioned mechanisms for change, because that's what really leads change. That's really how we're going to get our land back. And I just want to throw it out there that I think something that's really powerful for a lot of nations like mine and communities like mine is non-participation in the state control over not just our land but our lives. So when they can't come in there and they say, you guys need to start paying stumpage fees to cut wood, and I'm from a community where a lot of us heat our homes off of wood. Like my dad doesn't even have a furnace. He's only off of wood stove. And even people with furnaces don't have the money to heat exclusively off heating fuel, right? So when government says things like that, people just don't listen to them. And it creates a situation where Canadian sovereignty and state control over our people is extremely tenuous. And I think they realize that there's only so far they can push before people are at a mass level going to just not participate in a system where Canada and the government of the Northwest Territories are allegedly governing us. And I think they realize that it's not feasible for them to turn an entire community of like 500 people into criminals overnight because they're not agreeing with some new government law and policy. So I think when you have like a very clear point of destruction on your land, you need to mobilize, you need to get out there really proactively, and try to do something about that. When you don't necessarily have that, I think non-participation is a really effective way of engaging in nonviolent direct action when you're not actually in physical proximity to those points of destruction where the mining, the extraction is happening, or those points of decision, like those like capitals and like colonial legislatures where people are making these decisions about how you have to live and what happens on your land. Masi, thank you.
Y'all, we are so lucky to be joined by so many heavy hitters on this panel. That was incredible, Daniel. Thank you. There's yeah, that was so many great points. First one I wanted to touch on was the control over the land that you were talking about. And just that, Canada has such a strong, the US and Canada have such strongholds on Turtle Island here. And that energy sovereignty fundamentally will always come back to the means of production, and understanding that Mother Earth is an Indigenous femme. This is the most productive entity in our existence. And kind of like to connect what Melina and Daniel were talking about with what Melina was experiencing in their community with, there was people, because of this contamination and this environmental racism, pregnant Indigenous women were having miscarriages because of the sheer amount of pollutants, and so if the Indigenous females across Turtle Island are sick and not having kids, it's a way to ensure that it's a way to ensure the success of Canada and of the United States, because these colonial entities rely on our continued erasure as sovereign Indigenous peoples. And so thank you so much for that, Daniel. That was incredible. And the other two notes about free, prior, and informed consent, just really wanting to hammer that one in as paramount to any project that we could ever do in community, is that we are showing up to that community as an ask, as a guest, and we come and we inform them freely and before any project commences, informed. So we let them know everything that's going on, all of the bad, the good, and the ugly. And then consent. And it's really important that we note that consent or consultation is not consent. And a lot of governments and industry officials conflate these ideas of consultation with consent. You know, if they have some kind of community evening and, you know, host some questions and answers with asks, that's not free, prior, and informed consent of communities, you know. And so also wanted to highlight that Daniel was talking about nonviolent direct action as a really great way to enact change at the local, the national, and the international level, you know? Yeah, and yeah, that was really great, Daniel. Thank you. For folks that are watching and tuned in, this next portion will actually be turning on the Q&A function in the chat. And so if you're watching this webinar and you have any questions in mind that have come up in the last hour and you would like to ask either specific panelists or general questions to be answered, feel free to put a question in the chat and we can start because there's a few here actually. So this first one will go to Thomas Joseph. And so from Mario, thank you for this question. So if just transition can be viewed as an act of sovereignty, then how do intersections of colonial systems of oppression like anti-Blackness, cis-sexism, ableism, etc., inform our approaches to just transition? What does this look like in practice, particularly where multiple oppressive systems meet? For example, transphobia times ableism times colonialism. And I will hand this off to Thomas.
Thank you, Willow, and thank you for the question. You know, as our governments have been established underneath these colonial structures, our governments have also been heavily influenced by the privilege of patriarchy and how men in our communities now also benefit off of this patriarchy privilege. And so when we view that, that is now, as we're trying to shift to more sovereignty for our indigenous tribes, we must acknowledge that and acknowledge that, you know, before I did climate justice work, I was doing social justice work. And we have a saying in there that the first revolution is internal. Well, I would like to also say that when we think about a just transition, the first just transition is our own just transition, and how we view the world and how we start dismantling these systems of colonialism and patriarchy. And so when we think about the sovereignty of our tribe, we also must acknowledge that sovereignty comes with responsibility and accountability. We are responsible to future generations. We are responsible for our first commitments that we've had with our Mother Earth, and we are accountable to her. And we're also accountable to future generations. And so we can't just chalk up sovereignty as like, you know, we have the sovereign right to engage in forest offset projects or carbon markets. You actually have your sovereign right actually comes with the responsibility of making sure that we don't uplift and invest in false solutions to climate change. And so, you know, that responsibility also must consist of, we need to decolonialize ourselves. We need to understand that some of the best movements that I have been in, you know, it kind of takes me back when we were fighting a pipeline in Southern Oregon that was going underneath the river that was just undammed. You know, there was a landowner that didn't want to acknowledge the pronouns of the people in the room. And he's like, what does this got to do with the pipeline? And so he stormed out of the room. And so I went following him because he's got a heavy checkbook. And so I went and followed him. I was like, who do you think is going to protect your land when that pipeline's being shoved down our throats through eminent domain, which is actually a Canadian company, FYI. And you know, it's gonna be the transgender community that's going to be sitting in your trees, that's going to put their life on the line, and that's going to defend the sacredness of our Mother Earth, and you're going to benefit from that. You know, and so how can you internalize that to see a just transition within yourself in order to protect the sacredness of your own land? And so he didn't continue to organize with us anymore, but he did write a fat check, you know. And so when we think about trans community and creating space for people that are normally not welcome into spaces, you know, a trans person is also seeking a just transition. And what a greater opportunity that we have to include people that understand what a just transition looks like. understand the issues that they face and that we face as we're all struggling to find a just transition. So just take that as like the first step is ourselves, and to create that space for the people that have normally haven't been given that space, and that to understand that the matriarchs of our earth, of our planet, are leading the way, that they always led the way. You look at that dam removal, that was because of Indigenous women. At the end of the day, they did that heavy lifting. They held our communities together. They made sure that the people were continue to be in communication with each other so that those dams can come down. So thank you for that question.
There was a few times I got shivers in that response. Honestly, that was incredible. Um, God, yeah. Just highlighting how all of this work comes back to Native women, and again, like what Thomas was talking about too, just wanting to echo like how sacred it is to have queer, trans, two-spirit relatives on the front lines, and to be able to walk in both worlds and to still want to throw down for the land and for future generations, and so queerness is sacred and resistance is sacred. And so super sacred when we have queer resistances. I will pass this on to Melina, if you wanted to speak a bit about like either queerness on the front lines or this idea of sovereignty in action.
Yeah, I really appreciate the question that Mario put to around ableism. Also, because I feel like, again, the environmental movement is so chock full of ableism. It is actually hard to organize as a person with a disability in the environmental movement. And sometimes even in our own communities where people are able-bodied, because I organized and was in toxic zones for over a decade, I have an immunocompromised system. And it's been so hard for people that I've talked to, that I've organized with, that don't live in the tar sands, that have organized on tar sands nationally, organized out of their office in Toronto or Ottawa or Vancouver, where the air is clean. But for a decade, I was in a toxic zone, bringing in investors to divest, bringing in media, bringing in folks that wanted to see the on the ground situation of our communities, and breathing in this air, and now have an autoimmunity disorder and a medical diagnosis, but yet so many people will not acknowledge it. And they think, why is Melina wearing a mask inside one of our organizing rooms to do strategy? It's like there's so much ableism within our communities for invisible disabilities and then for visible disabilities. And so we, like our communities, not just non-Indigenous communities, but even Indigenous communities, a lot of times in the ceremonial spaces, there won't be ability or like accommodation for people that have disabilities to go into ceremonial spaces, because it's too hard to try to accommodate people. It's too hard to try to wear a mask because you don't want to wear a mask because other people literally can't attend things because you refuse to. So it's really like, as somebody that has had a disability through a car accident and all of these things, it's actually harder. It's kept me away from a lot of our community organizing spaces, because people just think like, well, you look okay, you look fine. And it's like, as you know, and I've talked to so many other people that have invisible disabilities and visible disabilities. And it's a very frustrating thing to try to communicate that to not only our people, but to our non-Indigenous peoples that are incredibly able-bodied a lot of the times, because they don't have to be growing up in toxic zones. They don't have to be dealing with autoimmunity issues because of toxicity and environmental racism. So I'm really happy that Mario brought that up, because it's very oppressive. It's hard to even organize and want to stay within movement spaces because of people refusing to acknowledge the differences that we all have within our bodies and our bodily autonomy going into spaces, and how that affects each and every one of us, and affects each and every one of our family members that might have an autoimmunity issue or a disability. So I think it's super important to think about how these are all interconnected. And one of the things that Sacred Earth Solar was so privileged to assist with was actually a disability lodge, a ceremonial lodge that was for two-spirited people, for people with disabilities, as well as for murdered and missing Indigenous family members, to go into that healing lodge. And we solarize their gathering space where people could come in and have warmth, have light, make tea, to be able to sleep there, to be able to change, and just be in a safe space when they went in and out of their ceremonial lodge. And so things like that, where we need to ensure that even our ceremonial spaces are safe for our people, especially if they're LGBTQIA plus and or have disabilities and all of the isms that come along with this effed up colonial world. So I'll just leave it there, but thank you so much for bringing this question up. Oh, you're on mute.
Oh, sorry about that. Great. Yeah, awesome notes about ableism there, Melina. And to kind of connect a bit about what Melina and Thomas were saying, and just that, like these mindsets are also a part of the just transition, because unfortunately, we're learning to self-replicate a lot of these systems of harm with our own families and with our own communities, like lateral violence. And, unfortunately, a lot of the relationship to our bodies and the land as an extension of our bodies has been informed by colonialism and capitalism in the last few hundred years. And so how we treat our bodies is, of course, how we treat the land, and so what Thomas was talking about with these just transitions, starts internally, and it starts with us. And so it starts with these mindsets, and then everything trickles out afterwards when we start to consider our bodies, the bodies of those around us, and all of the non-human bodies as well. Is a massive part of the just transition, is that this is not just about human beings, and we need to rework a lot of this human supremacy that is harming a lot of our other relatives here on Mother Earth. Thank you, Melina. That was awesome. We can go to Farron for a question and answer from the chat. So there was a question from, it was an anonymous attendee. But what are some of the best ways to ask non-Indigenous or settler folks to show up and support? So many environmental and government organizations are white, patriarchal, and even those well-meaning liberals who want to help and believe in just transitions and land back. We need them to stand with Indigenous communities and support, but we don't need them to take over or fall into savior roles.
Yeah, that's such an important and complicated question. And I think there's a couple of things that I would answer with. One is, first, just follow the leadership and the guidance of the communities that you're wanting to serve. So don't make assumptions about where you should be and try and swoop in as a savior. Really be following and listening. I think this is this movement in particular, and this space is such a good opportunity for us to really put on our listening ears and follow the guidance of Indigenous leadership. I think too, for settlers, in any work that you do and just in your daily life too, it is really important to practice self-reflexivity and really learn about your positionality and put a lot of effort and self-reflection into understanding where you do have power, where you do have privilege, where systems of oppression have affected you, and how your positionality can play a role in what you're doing for the just transition, because it is a just transition and there's a role for everybody, and nobody's going to get left behind in this. So anyone can be involved, including the settlers, but we have to do the work. And so that means just really learning about our own positions and following Indigenous wisdom, leadership, brilliance, and yeah, just making sure that equity deserving groups are at the forefront of the work that we do, and that we understand that it's not actually a just transition if it's not intersectional, and that we're not following the guidance of these groups that have systemically been excluded from this work.
Thank you for that, Farron. That's awesome. And yeah, great notes about how we can show up, and how we can show up in ways that doesn't take space away from those that have been historically displaced from those decision-making tables. And I like the note at the end of that question about avoiding savior roles, this idea of white saviorism and thinking that you know best for communities and you know what they need, and that is a tenet of white supremacy, to believe that you are the arbitrator of what is right, especially for communities and lands you do not come from. And for this last Q&A from the chat, I'll hand this one over to Daniel, if you want to come back on camera. So anonymous attendee asked, is there a guide or a way y'all recommend talking about land back in a way people would be more receptive to hearing about the concept behind it? I know there can be a lot of pushback with the title alone. How can we bring up these concepts in a way our congressmen or other parties would understand?
That's a good question. It sounds like you deal with different governments than I do. I think from my personal experience in dealing with colonial governments, you need to be patient, and you need to make an effort to be gentle. I don't deal with a lot of politicians. I deal with a lot of bureaucrats. And so in the work that I do, I try to personally be this way and encourage my team to be this way, and not to attack the people we're working with, because even though they are upholding oppressive garbage colonial positions, a lot of the time it's not up to them to do that. Like, that is not a decision they can unilaterally change. So attacking that individual person doesn't necessarily help. We end up spending, like, I've been doing negotiations for 7 years, and we're still extremely far from an agreement because of how far apart our respective positions are. But we have a very principled position, and we tell them that very clearly. Like, we tell them we want to have control over everything that happens on the land, because there's no point watering it down. There's no point trying to hide it. It's better to be upfront with that, but also to acknowledge that they can't agree to that immediately. Where you go from there is a difficult situation, but and I just want to say, like, I don't think most of us need to be doing this work. This work on its own of dealing with state power in that type of setting does not change things. Again, there needs to be that direct action. There needs to be people who are directly challenging power in other ways to force this type of change. But if you are in that role where you are the one who is in the meeting rooms, you need to be able to work on not getting angry, because I did that for a while and it's not productive, and finding ways that you can create the environment where you can have a really long conversation and be just mentally and emotionally prepared for the fact that you're probably not going to get anywhere with that conversation alone. I think I would also say you need to figure out in a little bit more detail what land back means for you. Because if you're dealing with colonial governments, they are always going to have that question about, what does that mean? If we write this down, what does that mean? So if what you're talking about with land back is some type of legislation, then you should come to them saying, land back, we drafted the legislation. So always have those answers for the questions that those type of people are going to ask, so you can provide that additional detail, because colonial governments always operate in writing, and they always operate in extremely inaccessible legal language with seemingly unnecessary levels of detail, often with things hidden in there that are somewhat insidious or treacherous for the positions that we're bringing. So just come prepared to answer all those follow-up questions, and whenever you get the opportunity, do the work for them. Write the things down. Don't let them write it down after the meeting. Masi, thank you.
Thank you for that, Daniel. That was awesome. Yeah, really important notes about how, like, the land cannot be acknowledged from the confines or the walls of an institution, and I think with, like, in this era of land acknowledgements and a lot of academic performatism, it's important to note that land back is never a theory and it's only a practice. Like, if your land acknowledgement does not include at the ending a stipulation about, and we should give our land back to them, I do not ever want to hear it. And so for that, so we kind of wrapped up the portion of the webinar with Q&A from attendees of the webinar. And so for this last little bit, we're coming up on half of an hour here. And so we will hear from the panelists one last time with some closing remarks. So if there's anything you want to share, amplify, or let us know, please feel free to do so in your closing remarks. And we'll start with Thomas, because I believe there's a bit of a time crunch there.
Appreciate that, Willow. Yeah, I gotta get moving. I just really want to share my appreciation for the rest of the panelists. It was an honor to be in space with you all. You guys really brought some heat. You know, it's amazing. You know, Daniel, we've been in spaces together. You know, I really appreciate the knowledge and the information that you share. And I'm really looking forward to what's to come out of our relatives from the north of what we call the medicine line. You know, it's important that we continue to figure out what a just transition is for us personally and within our communities, and to continue to lift up the importance of Indigenous peoples and their voice, and to know how to be in that space with them. So thank you all, and thanks for being here. Chat.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Thomas. For closing remarks, I will now pass this off to Farron.
Yes, I just wanted to say a big thank you to you, Willow, for hosting this, and our ASL interpreters, of course, and the other panelists as well. This is such important work, and it's such an honor to be here with all of you and be working in this space. And I'm leaving here with a lot of hope and a lot of inspiration for the work that we do. And maybe I'll end it with just like a little Easter egg from Sacred Earth too, which is that we are working on some just transition curriculum. So hopefully sending some education and training programs your way in the future. And we really hope that it's a tangible way for communities to implement a just transition in their community. So keep your eyes out for that. And thank you so much.
Thank you for joining us, Farron. Closing remarks, I will hear from Daniel.
Mossy, thank you, Willow, and everyone for being here. It's an honor to be on the panel with all the panelists and with you, Willow, and there's a lot of amazing people here. So I feel honored to be here. And I just want to say I have a degree in Canadian colonial law, and I work in these meeting rooms. But I just want to stress that the change comes from being out there on the streets and being out there on the land. That's what changes things. That's what's important. That's the vanguard. That's what does things, right? So all of the people who are holding it down in nonviolent direct action, thank you to you too, because that is what is leading like a fundamental transformation of the world, and a just transformation, right? And then I just also want to acknowledge that with just transition, with climate action, with like climate justice and environmental justice, what's foundational to that is Indigenous sovereignty. And that means we control what happens on our land. It should always be an Indigenous nation that controls what happens on their land. That's the premise of all of the change we want to see. And I'm glad so many people support that and are working for that and are fighting for that. And I encourage you and thank you for doing that. I really appreciate that. Masi.
Hell yeah, Daniel, thank you so much for joining. And last but absolutely not least, I will hand this off to Melina for closing remarks.
Well, thank you, first of all, Willow, for doing such an amazing facilitation job in moderating this panel. And so excited that there's future webinars that you're going to be involved with, and the Indigenous Climate Action team and Sacred Earth Solar team working together. And to continue these conversations after the launch of the JT Guide. Maybe we should put the JT Guide link in the webinar chat for folks if they haven't come across it yet. And also wanted to say that Sacred Earth and ICA are going to be in New York Climate Week together, and we're going to be doing a joint panel on divestment. So look out for that. So folks that aren't going to join, there's a hybrid ability too, and that's on September 24th. And then there's also, if you're going to be at New York Climate Week, there's ability to come join us in person in New York. So please check that out. And if you want any more information on that, just put your email in the chat, and then we can follow up if you haven't already received that, because we're going to be setting that out here quite soon. And just wanted to say thank you all. And yeah, hi.
Thank you so much, Melina. If we want to get a little bit of an update and hear from Elena, who is doing the graphic recording for this webinar, if you want to talk a bit about the process or anything you'd like to share with us. Whoa! Whoa, that's incredible. I can't believe you just busted that out in like an hour and a half. That's awesome. Wow.
Oh, there we go. There we go. Okay, so here I am back. I do have you guys were amazing. Holy crap. I have tons of notes to still add on to here. Which is always really awesome because when I join in on sessions that are, you know, an hour and a half or something like that, I usually have to do a little bit of cleanup afterwards, but and I'm slightly nervous about how much information I'll get, but you guys gave me so much information, so it's very clear that everyone here is so passionate about the work that you're doing, and you really, it's awesome. I forgot to mention in my intro, but I am from the Gitxsan Nation, so northern BC here in Canada, but I'm zooming in from Kamloops or Tecumseh to Secwepemc, and my family has been really involved in all things land back and making sure that our rights and titles are at the forefront of governance. So my family was a part of the Delgamuukw case as well, which obviously is a really big land back case. And so my uncle is Delgamuukw and my grandfather was also participating in that. So this whole session has been really amazing to listen in on and feels really close to my family. So Hamaya Twixnism, I am so appreciative of all the information. I can do a teeny little wrap up. Obviously, you guys can kind of read what's on the screen. But when we were talking about just transitions, there was talking about implementing solutions and making sure that Indigenous and dreaming and vision is a part of that. Also ensuring that there's more sustainable and self-sufficient and equitable futures. Obviously lots of conversation around land back, and I have so many notes to add in for the land back piece because you guys are just, like I said, so good at the conversation. And the fact that land back is a just transition and a just transition is land back, and this is going to benefit the entire world, not just our communities, and that Mother Earth needs us just as much as we need her. In the top right corner, I'm trying to represent the young girl that we talked about a lot, the 7-year-old that was on the barricades. So ensuring that we are recognizing that the younger generation is a part of this just as much as the older generation, that we are the land, the earth, the water, no matter what age we're at, and that we have an Indigenous responsibility to the land. And then also at the bottom here, obviously going to clean these guys up because I had to quickly doodle them in. But the first step to just transitions is ourselves, and our Indigenous knowledge is bigger than any university in the world. And yeah, it's just making sure that we all know that this whole process is a labor of love. And yeah, I'm excited to share back what it will look like as the completed graphic, because always when it's in its just transition, it's not always the cleanest, but I'm excited to be a part of the next few things. And like I said, Hamaya Toisnism, my heart thanks you for allowing me to participate.
Thank you so much for that, Elena. I genuinely blown away that you just busted this out in like an hour and a half, and like I can't believe you still have to put finishing touches on it because it looks awesome. Thank you so much for being a part of this today, and just letting folks know as well that Elena will be back to join us for parts 2 and parts 3, the 2 following Thursdays, for the second and third part of the Just Transition webinar series. And this recording will be available on ICA and Sacred Earth Solar's social media channels in the coming days. And for those that attended today, thank you so much for sharing this space. It was, we heard some incredible conversations and dialogue from some heavy hitting panelists. And thank you so much to Elena and to Hercules and Jenny for the ASL interpretations and the graphic recording. We super appreciate it. And on that note, I will wrap this up, but we will see you the next 2 Thursdays. Thanks, everybody.